Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, I'm Lecture16 and we will be continuing on our course on Indian art, and today we'll be going into our module 4 and week 4, and that is architecture 2. So we have already covered architecture 1, in which we have looked into the basics of Buddhist and Jain architecture, and today we'll be looking into Hinduism and temple building. So in module 4 or in the week 4, we'll be looking into the details of Hindu idea of architecture as well as sculpture and so on, and that sort of how that gives an idea between the deities, the devotees, the architecture, the spaces around us, and the materials which are incorporated usually as part of worship. Now, in terms of Hinduism, there are certain characteristic features that we need to first get into, and those are the things that how Hinduism does not really have one founding figure, but there are multiple figures or multiple sources from which these ideas or these ways of life have emerged. So unlike the kind of religions we have looked into, for example, Buddhism and Jainism, we know from where they have started. For example, Buddhism has started from one particular person who is known as Gautama Buddha or Buddha the Shakyamuni, and then for Jainism we have looked into a number of Tirthankaras. There are 424 Tirthankaras, and the last one was the last person was a contemporary of Shakyamuni Buddha. So unlike those, we see that in terms of the Hindu practices, we do not really know that from where it started or if that had started from multiple sources at the same time. And that is the reason we see from the very beginning there is multiplicity in the conception of Hinduism as well as the way the practices have been carried out. So from the very early beginning, we see that there are many ways in which Hindu practices have evolved, and in terms of the deities, we find there are multiple deities who have been worshipped, and so based on the communities, we find that some deities are preferred by certain communities, whereas the other deities are preferred by the others. And for these communities, we find that whoever their respected deities are, they are considered to be the supreme energy in the universe. And that is perhaps one of the prime characteristics of Hinduism, that we do not really see that there is only one way of being, but there are multiple. And that is also something that adds to the ideas, that also something that adds to the way in which architecture and sculpture they have been modeled over time. Now, after the Indus Valley period, if we see that what are the ways in which we have certain evidences, so we see that after the Indus Valley period between 1500 BC and 500 BC, it seems like there have been this ideas about enshrining the deities, something that was not really been there before that. So it can be imagined that the absence of the specific Hindu deities in terms of their figurative expression or figurative idols or images, that perhaps explains, because that perhaps relates to the Vedic practices or the practices in which the deities were evoked through sacrificial fire and different kind of rituals which did not really require making images or making sculptures. So that kind of abstracted practices in which we find in the Vedic period, which is understood as the post Indus Valley period, during this time we find that there are practices where this sacrificial fire was created in this square yagna heims, or the places where this altars, the brick altars were made, and in which yagna or the sacrificial rites were performed. performed. So again we are going back to some of these ideas of brick and use of terracotta, and perhaps those are also some of the reasons for which we do not really find substantial amount of evidences from these times. However, some of the literary sources or some of the hymns of Vedas, they tell us about such kind of practices. Now, as I have mentioned earlier, that we find that between 1500 BC and 500 BC, sometime during this time, the idea of enshrining deities that had emerged in the Hindu practices, and that is the character that sort of gave rise to making of temples. So during this time we also find, I mean, from the very early times in Hinduism, there have been a tendency towards worshipping nature and different forces of nature. So for example, if we see the thunderbolt and thunderstorm, and then how those are related to the monsoon, and then monsoon eventually relates to architecture and prosperity. So those are the reasons we find that, I mean, thunderbolt becomes one of the a weapon or a particular attribute towards of god Indra, who was considered to be one of the prime gods during this formative period of Hinduism. Now, apart from that, we also find there are other deities, for example, the sun god, the sun being the source of our lives. So that is something that is a very important element of our lives and livelihood and everything else, and that is the reason we find that sun god had also been very important part of the Hindu worships. Now, similarly, we also find that there are many other forces of nature, for example, water and many other things, for example, air and so on. They have also been considered to be the deities, or how they have also been worshipped by the people. Now, with that, we see towards the end of this time period, like as I have mentioned, that between 1500 BC and 500 BC. So towards end of this time period, perhaps closer to 500 BC and so on, there have been a rise of the three new gods, and they were considered to be this new Hindu trinity. So they moved slightly away from the way the god Indra, the king of the gods, the way they have been considered, and now the Hindu trinity we find to be Shiva, Brahma and Vishnu. So these three gods came to be considered as the Hindu trinity, and they were related to the process of creation, sustainment and destruction. So Brahma was the one who was considered to be related to creation, whereas Vishnu is the one who's been considered as the nourisher or sustainer, and then we know as the god Shiva, who's related to the idea of destruction. And through this we also find that there is not really a linear flow of time which has been attributed here, but this is a cyclical flow. So it starts from creation, goes into sustainment and then to destruction, but destruction makes a way for this new creation, and that is how this cycle of life and death continues. And that is also one of the reasons in which we find that in Hindu philosophy there is this idea about birth and rebirth, which also corresponds to the formation of these deities and the overall philosophy which shapes the Hindu ideas. Now, from there, if we think about the evidences, the sculptural evidences or the architectural remains that we find from the very early times, so some of the very early images that we find and which can be specifically attributed to the Hindu gods and goddesses, those will be perhaps the one we have on screen in the left side, and that is the Shivalingam at Gudimallam in the Chittoor district of Andhra Pradesh. So this is a replica of the actual image that we have here, and here what we find that in this particular image there is a vertically erect male genitalia which is also called lingam, and there is the figure whom we find who holds a weapon in his left arm, and he also holds an animal in his right arm, and then he stands on the top of a demon like figure which was later on, which could also be considered as the demon of ignorance, apasmara. So what we find here, it's a very interesting kind of amalgamation of the fertility related images, at the same time how the symbolism of fertility and then the role of the deities, they come together in this image. So there is not really an implicit but an explicit depiction of a male genitalia that we can find here, and that is vertical, and then in the body of this male genitalia we have the image of this person. So this person, for its relationship to this lingam like shape, so that is the reason he is considered to be one of the early forms of god Shiva. And then if you also see the kind of railing that it surrounds the figure, and this is there with this railing, and this figure is kind of sunken in the Garbhagriha or the womb chamber of this temple in Gudimallam. And if you see the railing also follows something like this the post, like the bars and the column like formation, which we have already seen in the fencing of Sanchi and Bharut. So this figure is considered, this particular the Shiva Lingam at this temple of Gudimallam, this is considered to be built somewhere between 3rd century and 2nd century BC, which comes very close to the period when the Bharut Stupa and later on the Sanchi Stupa was built. So we can imagine that how certain ideas, for example the way in which this fencing has been made, and if we also get into the details of the figure, in which like the way the ornaments are depicted, the way the overall expression of the face and the body they have been constructed, all of them bear high resemblance to the ones we have seen in Sanchi as well as in Bharut and so on. So it is again a reminder for all of us to think that even though there are different religions we are talking about, but the artistic expressions are not distinct from each other. So one religion would borrow from the other, and there are always transactions and there are always exchanges between these religions that had happened in the past. So if this is one of the prime deities that we find, how some of the early figures of Lord Shiva had appeared in southern India, then some of the other figures will be there. For example, the one we have on the right side of the screen, and this is a head of goddess Uma or goddess Durga, who was, and this is a massive bust of goddess Uma or goddess Durga, which was found from Ghazni in Afghanistan. So that also says something about how this the religions and the identities were not really marked by the kind of the geographical places that we understand as the Indian subcontinent or the country of India today. Now what we also find there, and this particular figure, the bust of goddess Uma, that comes from perhaps 2nd century or 3rd century AD. So much later from the one which we have looked into in the slide in the left. However, we also see, if we consider the kind of the style of making this figure, and also like the way the hair has been made, and then the eyes, and of course the ornaments and everything else, they bear a high resemblance to the Bodhisattva images that we have studied so far. And so that also says something about this common aesthetic choices and the aesthetic decisions the sculptors and the artisans they have made during this time period, at the same time in these regions, which gave rise to this aesthetic quality of the Gandharan sculptures, which persisted not only in one religion but in many. Now another important thing it might be that sometime we do not have a particular time frame to suggest that, I mean, when it started, but we also see that, I mean, during this time, perhaps in the 1st millennium BC or so on, we also see that how the cult of the goddess or the worshippers of the goddess, they have considered the goddess like for example the goddess Durga or goddess Uma and so on, they to be the supreme power of the universe instead of Shiva, Vishnu and Brahma. So that also gave rise to the tantric practices in which we find the supremacy of the goddess and not the gods. So we have the Vedas and the Tantras, both are simultaneously developing during these times. From there, if we go a little further into the visual expressions and how images were considered, at the same time how this expressions shaped the belief system, in which we find that there are certain things which are much more abstracted. So for example, if we start with the idea that how in Hinduism the idea of the entire universe or the cosmos had been constructed, so there is this idea of Brahmanda, or this particular this Brahmanda comes from this particular egg which is called Hiranyagarbha, and in which that's the golden egg, and from which we find that that egg had exploded and then the entire creation had came into being. So and this particular explosion that we find there is something that is related to Brahma's deed of creation. So it expanded, and that is how different elements came into being, and the multiplicity and the complexity of all the living beings and the non-living beings came into existence. So that is how it has been constructed. Now for those abstracted notions, we find that in Hindu visual culture or in Hindu art, there are both ways of expressions. So if we consider the image in the left side of our screen, there is this abstracted Shiva Lingam, and if we see the Shiva Lingam, there is this small linga or this male genitalia which has been depicted on this high pedestal. Now this pedestal, if we see it very closely, there is a square base for this lingam, and the square base is a symbolic representation of the yoni or the female genitalia, and it has been considered how Prakriti or the female genitalia comes in, and then the union between Prakriti and Purusha, and the Purusha is something that is symbolized by the male genitalia here. So the union between them are integral to any acts of creation. So that is something that we also find to be embedded in this abstracted formation of the Shiva Linga. If we think this is one abstracted expression of this really developed philosophy, on the other hand, we also find expressions. For example, we have a Mukhalingam, in which we find there is a image of Lord Shiva, which is projected out of this abstracted linga shape, and that comes from 5th century Mathura. And so in this one, we see that how there is a kind of an in-between stage where the figurative representation of Shiva that comes in contact with the abstracted idea of a lingam. So there are, as I have already mentioned, that there is not really one way of looking into these images, but there are multiple ways, and so that's the reason we find that high narrative expressions in Hindu art, at the same time there can also be like highly abstracted expressions. So both these things are possible. So from there, if we move little further to the kind of the structures and the architecture, that they mark the early stage of the Hindu building practices, and in which we find that again we are going back to some of the natural structures of the living rock structures. So for example, we find that there have been this idea about how this particular idea about enshrining the beloved deities or the deities whom we worship, so to make a house for them. This is a particular idea that we find it is slightly different from, or perhaps a bit different from, the way we have seen in the Jain and in the Buddhist philosophy. So in the structures in Buddhism and Jainism, we found that there was a prevalence towards the structures such as monastery, viharas and chaityas, like the places where everyone gathers and they worship, or like the monasteries, which is predominantly used by the monks, the nuns and the ascetics. Here we find that there is a slightly different approach towards building a house for the gods, and that is that there are two concepts coming together. The first one is there is a the house of the gods is something that is understood as the house which is inhabited by the high royals or the kings, and the gods are considered as the kings of the kings. So that is the reason what we understand, what we find here is that the structures which were erected, or even the ones which are carved out of the rock shelters or the living rock structures, they all are been considered to be a symbolic representation of a prasada or a palace like a complex. Then the other important part of these temples we find in terms of the architectural metaphors is this particular womb chamber. Now the womb chamber is the one that is been understood, and as all the lives they start from the mother's womb. So the womb chamber is something that is considered to be the most sacred space where the deity figures are installed, and the womb chamber is usually a dark, a small space, not where there will only be one entrance or one way to go inside, and it also does not really allow many people to go inside these places. So really secluded, really exclusive a space which is dark and which sort of evokes the sense of a womb. So that is the womb chamber we find, that is also something very important part of the Hindu temples. So as I have said that, I mean, the entire structure of the temple might also resemble the prasadas or the palace complexes, but the main part, or like, I mean, the part where the deity figures are installed, that is something that is related to the mother's womb or the womb chamber, which is also called in Sanskrit as Garbhagriha. So what we find in some of the early examples, the womb chamber, like this particular rock shelter like the formation, that actually comes together with the actual the living rocks. So for example, as we have see here, there is a cave temple here in the left side of the screen, and that is in Udayagiri in Madhya Pradesh. So in the earlier module or in the week, we have already studied that Udayagiri in the Buddhist context, and which comes from Odisha, but here we are looking into Udayagiri, which is from Madhya Pradesh. And in Madhya Pradesh, what we find here, that there are this series of caves which were excavated during 4th to 5th century, which is also the time period of the Guptas. So which is considered to be which has significantly contributed to the making of Indian art and architecture. And during this time period, we find how this sandstone caves were excavated, and so some of the examples, for example, the one we see in the left side of the screen, in which we find how this living rock structure had actually been carved in such a way that it resembles this temple like form, the temples that we are most habituated to look at today. And then there are the guardian figures towards by the entrance gateway to the sanctum sanctorum. And so there are some of this simple formation of the temple that we find, that how these simple forms, they started being called as the temple. So the main areas in a temple, those will be the Garbhagriha or the womb chamber, and then the entire structure resembles a prasada or a palace complex. Now how this prasada comes into being, that will be discussing little more in the next image. And from there I also wanted to show that how there are the rock cut sculptures. So the architecture cannot really be separated from this rock cut sculptures, because there is not really a distinction there in this time period. Until 19th century, we do not really see that kind of distinction. So what we have here, this is also a high relief in which the images are carved almost in three-dimensional quality, except for its back, which is attached to the wall of this living rock structures. And in this one we find that there is the boar incarnation, or the Varaha incarnation of Lord Vishnu, who's represented in this particular image, and he is seen here to be rescuing the Bhu Devi, or like the earth goddess. So this is something we find that slowly how the temple structures that start having this divisions, in which like there is this exclusive the womb chamber, within which there is a dark chamber, and there is not really too many activities can happen inside it. And then there are other areas of this particular the temple complexes, or areas where the devotees can see the great deeds of the gods. So in one hand we have this highly figurative narrative expressions, on the other hand we have this very exclusive space only for the devotees to go there, and it's to perform their homage, or their whatever rites in seclusion. So these two things, even though they seem like these ideas are distinct from each other, but they are also performed side by side, the way I have already explained that how Hinduism from the very beginning, it thrived on the idea of multiplicity, and not really like one way or the other, but many things at the same time. Now from there, if we get into the details about how the architectural spaces are constructed in this particular in the as part of the Hindu temples, we find that noted scholar Michael Meister had elaborated on this issue, and his analysis also had brought up some of the ways in which the ground plans of these temples were laid out. And one of the very efficient ways in which to look at these ground plans will be to consider the idea of Vastu Purusha Mandala. And Vastu Purusha Mandala is the particular mandala or the ground plan that we have in the left side of the screen, in which we find that there is this square space which had been divided in many other squares, and usually there are I must say that there are many opinions about whether the divisions are even or they are uneven. However, what we find that to be very important is in this particular in this Vastu Purusha Mandala, in this particular ground plan, there is one space which is at the center, which is considered to be the space which is dedicated to the Lord Brahma, and Brahma is someone who's also related to the act of creation. So if we consider that this is a ground plan for any of the Garbhagriha or the Sanctum Sanctorum, in which we can imagine that in the central space which is kept for Lord Brahma, that is the space in which the deities will be installed. And so at the center of this Vastu Purusha Mandala, which is also a metaphor creation, is the space where the deity figures are installed and worshipped by the devotees. And this also gives us a sense of how this square ground plan for all this for the Garbhagriha is something that is uniformly seen almost everywhere in the Hindu temples. I mean, of course, I am excluding the contemporary Hindu temples, but mostly the ones which have which have followed the architectural treatise from the very early period, we find this particular ground plan had been implemented in most of these temples. We will be continuing on the vertical the elevation of this structure in the next lecture. Thank you.